Hi, my name is Udit Hinduja, and I am with Kavitha Rao, the author of Spies, Lies, and Allies, published by Westland. We're joined by Kavitha at ThePrint soft cover, where we are launching her book. Kavitha, thank you so much for joining us. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to just quickly get started and jump straight in. So this particular book over here is about two Indian revolutionaries. I wanted to ask you, why did you choose these two particular revolutionaries to focus your book around? Because I know that in the book you've mentioned a lot of revolutionaries, right? There are a lot of names, some familiar, some not so familiar, that keep on popping up. And I, as a reader who don't know too much about the lesser known revolutionaries, wanted to, of course, know so much about, for example, Madam Kama is there or Rash Bihari Bose is there. So why did you pick Chatto and Roy for your book?
So, I've always wanted to write a non-fiction book that reads like fiction. Something really exciting, something that almost reads like, like the Day of the Jackal style thriller. And obviously, all historical figures do not lend themselves to this treatment. But when I started reading about these two men, they actually led these lives. Their lives were almost exactly like Day of the Jackal. They were pursued by, Secret Service agents across Europe, across America, across Mexico, across Russia. Their lives were, when they say truth is stranger than fiction, their lives were exactly that, because they were always staying one, hop, skip, and jump ahead of the police. They met and encountered all the great figures of their time, like, Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, Lala Lajpat Rai, Gandhi, Nehru, Savarkar, Mao, Chiang Kai shek. So their lives were just so exciting that I couldn't not write about them, to be honest. So, that's why I chose them.
No, that's very interesting. And in your book, you really talk about their upbringing a lot.
Yes.
And it was so interesting to see how varied and different their upbringings were. So could you maybe talk a bit about that? Like, what exactly are the ingredients that go into making a revolutionary at that time? For example, Chatto, as maybe people aren't aware, but Chatto was Sarojini Naidu's brother.
Yes.
And I found that very interesting, how even coming from the same family, both of them lived very different lives. They have very different ideas on the freedom struggle and how to go about it.
Yes. So the two men are Virendranath Chattopadhyaya and MN Roy. And Chatto, as we call him, was Sarojini Naidu's brother. So he grew up in Hyderabad in a large and very distinguished family. Sarojini was the eldest sister, Chatto was the eldest brother. Another brother was Harindranath Chattopadhyaya, who later became a very famous poet and actor. And another sister was Suhasini, who married A.K. Nambiar, who was, well known to be a spy. So it was a very distinguished and intellectual family. They grew up in Hyderabad in what was called the Golden Threshold. A big family with a very secular family, a lot of emphasis on education, cosmopolitan upbringing, and he had a very privileged upbringing, and he was sent to the UK to study law. But he gave that up and immediately joined the revolutionary movement. And MN Roy had an actually completely different upbringing. So he was born in rural West Bengal, and this was at the time of this Bengali nationalism, robust Bengali nationalism, as I call him, with Aurobindo Ghosh, Bipin Chandra Pal, and the Anushilan Samiti, which was an association of nationalist young men, which they emphasize both spiritual development as well as physical development. So Emin Roy became, as they call it, a bomb thrower. He calls himself a terrorist. So he was involved in revolutionary activity at a very young age, throwing bombs at British institutions, British people. And he was also very influenced by Bhaga Jatin, who was a famous Bengali revolutionary of the time. So he had a completely different upbringing, almost zero education. He educated himself, but he also arrived at the same destination as Chatto in a way, because they both became early revolutionaries. And then, of course, later they switched paths, but this was their early beginning.
Okay.
Yeah.
If I recall correctly, Bhaga Jatin was the one who fought a tiger.
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's right. That's how he gets his name. He fought a tiger with, virtually his bare hands, just with a knife. and he killed it, and then he became sort of famous for that. But he was also involved in a lot of revolutionary activity at the time, and he came to a very tragic end when he was killed by police,
Which had a big impact on Roy.
which had a big impact on MN Roy. Yes, that's right.
And Kavita, why do you think that these two revolutionaries decided to go outside India to garner support for the movement?
Because at the time they desperately needed arms and money, and Chatto was already in the UK to study law. That's where he went there in the first place. There he used to attend meetings at India House, which is a house in London which was devoted completely to revolutionary activity. So people who were living in the house at that time were Savarkar and Krishna Varma and Madanlal Dhingra. These were all the early revolutionaries, and Chatto was very influenced by them. And he decided to put out propaganda. He was writing letters, he was writing pamphlets. Then later he was forced to flee across Europe simply because the British Secret Service were constantly pursuing him. In fact, Chatto featured prominently in a story by Somerset Maugham, where he was sort of immortalized as a spy Chandra Lal, spy and anarchist Chandra Lal, and the British Secret Service even tried to assassinate him. They tried to assassinate him. He escaped in the nick of time. MN Roy first ended up moving to Java and to Japan because he was trying to get arms and money for India, unsuccessfully, as it turned out. And then he decided to move to the US because he wanted to, there was a lot of revolutionary activity going on there. The Ghadar party was very active there. And he decided to move there. And then he decided to move to Mexico because he was pursued by the police. So quite often their movements were prompted by the police hard on their tail, Secret Service, British police, British intelligence, hard on their tail. We often don't realize how difficult the lives of the early revolutionaries were. Where they were constantly pursued by the British intelligence service. They had no money. They lived hand to mouth, and there was virtually no kind of support or infrastructure for them. Yeah.
No, it's very interesting. I also read that there was a point where Roy was trying to garner support from the Germans,
Right.
and they were going to give him weapons,
Yes.
but finally they just kept on, I don't know, delaying it or shafting him,
Sure.
and they never ended up giving him any money because they just didn't trust the Indian revolutionaries.
Absolutely, that's a very good question. So, one obstacle that the early Indian revolutionists constantly had was that people were not willing to believe that India could govern herself on her own. And these people included, as you said, Roy tried to do a deal with Germany. Because they were at that time, they were allies of, they were against Britain. So they were the enemies of Britain. So he decided that he would make an alliance with them, and he was promised money. But the last minute, the German ambassador withdrew the money, and he said, I just don't believe that India can be independent, that you can rule yourself. This was a constant theme. Some years later, Chatto was in Stockholm, and in the Netherlands working with the early socialists. And while the early socialists were very prepared to, extend socialist activity into India, they still would not believe that India could govern herself. There was this, constant racism, Orientalism, that no, India has to be kind of, a vassal of Britain. In fact, even Hitler, though he was, by this time, the Second World War, he was fighting against Britain, even he believed that India could never be independent of Britain. He believed that, they were an inferior race, Indians were an inferior race. So they constantly had this battle, and it obviously, as we know in hindsight, it obviously took a man of the stature and charisma of Gandhi to sweep India to independence by choosing non-violence and choosing satyagraha. So, yeah.
Do you think that anything would have changed? Let's say that any of these powers finally did say, okay, fine, we'll give you the weapons. And I know that's a big what if, but how do you think the course of history would have changed if, let's say, any of these revolutionaries actually got those weapons?
It's hard to say. But I I can't say for sure, but I don't think it would have made that much of a difference. I do think that it was only Gandhi who could unite all of India. If you read the book carefully, you will see that Chatto and Roy, their ideas were wonderful in some ways and very innovative in some ways, but they were not mass ideas. Nehru knew this. Nehru sympathized with some of their, cosmopolitan, internationalist, globalist ideas. But he knew that the only man who could take a very poor country to independence was Gandhi. And I think most of us acknowledge that with all his faults, that satyagraha was the only way to get the sympathy of the world. I do not think revolution would have got the sympathy of the world, but I do think revolution should be studied nevertheless. You know.
No, very interesting.
Yeah.
They of course, I know that you touched upon both their travels to different parts of the world, garnering support. Is there any particular story that really stood out for you when you were writing the book, from either of their stories when they were traveling?
Um, I mean, for me, I think the relationship that Chatto had with Agnes Smedley, it stands out for me because I guess as a woman, and I also because I think it shows how imperfect these men were. So a brief explanation: Chatto had a love affair with a woman called Agnes Smedley, who was an American journalist and activist. And she was also an India file and was deeply sympathetic towards the Indian cause for independence. And you would have thought that, they would have, had a really great, relationship, but they had a very tumultuous and, in the end, toxic relationship because Chatto, though a revolutionary, on the streets, was, sort of a reactionary in the sheets. He was not able to tolerate her independence. He treated her like a household drudge. He expected her to cook and clean and, look after all the other revolutions that were coming to her house. And eventually Smedley left him because she said, I cannot tolerate being treated as a domestic slave. And she went on to have a checkered and very brilliant career because she went to China to cover Mao's rise. Mao was just coming to prominence, and she covered the Long March and she walked with the Red Army. And this just shows that, in even in my previous book, I saw the same thing, it was called Lady Doctors. It is about revolutionary, Indian, the first Indian women doctors. Often their husbands, in theory, they wanted their wives to study and, progress and do great things. But in practice, they always found it very difficult. And they eventually some of them ended up restricting their wives and, telling them what to do. And I think this just shows how human these men were, that and how fallible and how imperfect, that even though they talked constantly about liberalism, cosmopolitanism, revolution, progress for both men and women, they were not able to implement it in their personal lives. You know?
Yeah. And when you're reading about it, you think that they're leading these very exciting lives, romancing all these women, traveling the world. But the reality, of course, is very, very different. Of course, they're living in countries and they're trying to garner support. But like you said, they're literally living hand to mouth. It's difficult for them
Yes.
to make a living as they keep on moving from place to place.
Yes, I mean, I wrote this book. I intended it, I do say right in the introduction, I did not intend it to be an inquiry into political systems like communism versus capitalism versus, other systems. I really wanted it to be an inquiry into what it is to be human, what it is to try and fail and try again and suffer and mess up, because they messed up a lot. And as you said, they had very tumultuous relationships with the women in their lives, Chatto especially so. Roy actually got some support. Both his wives were very devoted women, but he didn't treat them very well. But he got a lot of support from them. And they often lived very hand to mouth existence. Chatto, I think, suffered immense loneliness because he says so in many meetings, but he could never come back to India because, the British police would have arrested him. And therefore, he lived in constant exile. And I don't think I've mentioned this. Chatto came to an untimely end, which nobody knows about. He was eventually executed by Joseph Stalin in Stalin's Great Purge of 1937. But his death was not discovered until many years later in 1991 when the KGB archives became public. So Chatto came to this sticky end, and nobody, not even his own sister Sarojini Naidu, knew about it. So that to me was just immensely tragic, and that is yet another part that I want to kind of bring out. In fact, I start the book with his
Correct.
tragic demise.
Correct.
So because that to me strikes me as really really sad, because by that time, by 1937, Chatto was a communist, but ironically he was executed by Stalin for no particular reason, because the Great Purge happened for the most irrational reasons, really.
Correct.
So
And it's a good segue because you've brought up Stalin and Chatto, but what about Roy? Because Roy also kind of rose up in the ranks of the Communist Party, and he's like the founder of Indian communism, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but he was almost like Lenin's not protege, but
yes.
was in his good graces, if anything.
Absolutely, you are not wrong. Roy was called Lenin's young man. Both Chatto and Roy had a rivalry as to see who could get Lenin's support, because back then, the Bolshevik Revolution had just happened, and all eyes were on Lenin. And now, of course, we know better, but back then the Red Army was idolized by all the colonized peoples of the world, because they were looking to them for guidance and support. And Roy won this battle because he had contacts, he had charisma. I mean, Roy was an immensely charismatic man. All accounts speak of him as being very, very charismatic, and able to speak well, and deal with different nationalities, and despite his poor education. And MN Roy won this battle, and Chatto was sidelined. So Lenin backed MN Roy, and the Comintern, which was the Communist International, all the international associations of communism, they actually sent Roy on several, slapdash errands. None of them turned out well. Okay, they sent him to China to convert, help convert the whole of China into communism. That did not work. They sent him to Tashkent, where with a lot of arms, with and wagon load full of gold. It's a really exciting tale. That also did not work. And many of Roy's escapades did not work for various reasons, not entirely his fault, but for various reasons that I detail in the book. So he became a favorite of Comintern, but eventually they expelled him, and he fell from grace and was forced to return to India, where he was imprisoned for 6 long years. You know?
Yeah, there's a point in the book where you mentioned that he had kind of like a blind spot when it came to Stalin.
Yes.
Is there, like, what exactly did you mean by that? Was he just not playing the field correctly? Was he just not aware of Stalin's rise to power and what a threat Stalin could be?
Roy had a soft spot for Stalin for many years, though he did see reason in the end, and he left communism and became a humanist. So he saw, eventually he saw reason. The thing is that Stalin's misdeeds were hidden for a very long time from even his own people. Nobody knew. People disappeared in the middle of the night, and nobody knew that they had gone to the Gulag. And Stalin's misdeeds were hidden from his own people, and it was only 3 years after his death in 1956 when Nikita Khrushchev gave what's called the secret speech and revealed the extent of Stalin's crimes. In fact, MN Roy did not even know Chatto's fate. He says that Chatto has disappeared. I do hope he has not been, taken away, arrested. He may have suspected, but he did not know. And for many years, Roy had an admiration for Stalin. But then he saw reason, and he decided that collectivism did not work. And he switched to radical humanism, which, emphasizes the individual and emphasizes rationalism. He still clung to rationalism, and, he was an atheist. And because of that, he had great, great differences with Gandhi. So,
No, it's very interesting. I wanted to ask you about because I know there are a lot of stories, by the way, in this
yes.
book, and
Yes,
it is a very quick, like action-packed tale of these two revolutionaries that I believe people should know about. Like I mentioned, there are a lot of different revolutionaries that feature in this
I'm
book.
so glad you said that, because my chief aim in writing this book was to write a very simple book for the lay reader. It is not a scholarly book. I cannot emphasize this enough, because there have been scholarly books written on these men, great ones. But I wanted every ordinary person to read this book, and in order to do that, I had to condense events. It's basically pressy, right?
Yeah.
And I hope I've done a good job on that, because I obviously didn't want to dumb it down, but at the same time I wanted to make it really simple and easy to read, because it's a vast stage across many years. So
Exactly. So that's exactly why I wanted to ask you, how did you manage to, because like you said, the material that you read was probably biographies or dense scholarly
yes,
material. So what was your process in terms of kind of converting that into this kind of spy thriller? That's how I would call this book, it's literally reads like a spy thriller. So
that's a
what was
compliment for me.
what
I'm sure some historians would think of that as an insult. However, I think of it as a compliment.
Okay, great,
So,
great. So
yeah.
what was that process like? Like, how did you kind of, what type of material did you go through? What was
Yes.
the writing and the researching process like for a book like
So,
this?
unfortunately or fortunately, this book was completely archival, by which I mean that I trace the Chattopadhyaya family. Descendants still survive, but they remember nothing of him. They don't even have any letters, so they were not able to help. And nobody remains of the Roy family, because MN Roy and his wife did not have children, or at least I couldn't trace anybody. Maybe there were some nieces and nephews, but I couldn't trace them. So everything was letters, memoirs, and pamphlets. MN Roy wrote a huge number of books. In fact, I think there is scarcely an issue in the world that MN Roy did not have an opinion on. He was a man who had so many opinions, and my challenge was to, how do I condense all his opinions into simple things? And most of this research I say was done at the British Library in London. And without that I would not have been able to write this book. It's all hours and hours spent pouring there. And I chose a particular structure where one chapter is Chatto and one chapter is Roy, and that also gave me difficulty, by the way. I wanted to show how they are on opposite ends of the world, but they have sort of these parallel lives, where they have sort of similar lives, but they never meet, but they're in agreement. And, I don't know, I just kept writing, making copious notes, and condensing and condensing and condensing and condensing. And I must give a shout out to my editors at Westland. All of you, without you, this book could not have been what it was, because they helped so much. Particularly one editor, Kushal Rani Gulab, who really helped me in making the book make sense, because all these diverging timelines, I had index cards, I had a huge row of index cards laid out on my floor, and even then I expect I have made mistakes, and I expect there will be corrections, because that always happens. uh, I've just tried. It went through many rewrites. I don't know whether the process. I just decided that I'm going to focus on the most important events. And I don't know if you notice, every chapter starts with as exciting an anecdote as I can muster, because I want the reader to be drawn in and not kind of just be lost.
Yeah.
So
And I really like the way you brought in all these more popular figures,
yes,
the Gandhis, the Nehrus, the Savarkars, how you brought them in and gave that additional context, so
yes,
they weren't just isolated
no,
in their journeys, they interacted with a lot of very, very famous
yes,
freedom fighters and other revolutionaries and political figures, and that set a lot of context to their entire struggle as well. So I
yes,
really enjoyed reading about that.
yes,
And particularly about Savarkar, because when he was at India House, I didn't know this. It was interesting to read, and of course you must have done a lot of research on other revolutionaries as well while you were writing this book. But on Savarkar, I didn't know that his political ideology was a lot more liberal, if I'm not mistaken, in his
yes.
early
In the
days.
early days, Savarkar was not as, right wing as we think of him today. He was more liberal, and of course he was very favor of Indian independence. So he was not a moderate. There were early moderates who were okay with dominion status for India. So right from the beginning, Savarkar believed in full independence for India, and he would give fiery speeches about that, which I think motivated Chatto. And but he was not as right wing as back in the day. So my writing on Savarkar is confined to that time. I haven't gone into his future things because the thing is that that would make the book even larger. I could go into many events, but it had to stop at a certain time.
Correct.
Yeah.
There was one part about Savarkar which I really laughed out loud, was when he escaped this
Yes.
ship,
Yes.
and I believe he put oil
He
on his
put grease on
grease.
himself, and when he was being transported from England to France, he greased himself all over and escaped through the porthole so he could slip through. And practically naked, he ran over the, Chatto and Savarkar appear to have been quite good friends. I know, Savarkar is controversial today, but my book doesn't really go into that because I only look at him in his relationship to Chatto. And Savarkar, escaped, but then he was caught again and taken back because he couldn't speak French, and he was running about on the, kind of on the port, and he was taken back. And Virendranath Chattopadhyaya, who always wrote with a very sort of very flowery and lyrical style, he writes about this quite memorably, in the book.
And finally, Kavitha, I know you addressed this also in the first few chapters of the book itself, but by all accounts, both Chatto and Roy were, well, not, I don't want to say unsuccessful, but they had a lot of trouble in terms of garnering support, and
Absolutely.
a lot of their quote unquote missions, let's say, were failures, for example,
Sure.
right? So, what exactly can we learn from something like this, from these quote unquote unsuccessful revolutionaries?
It's a complicated question, and in fact, when I first started writing this book, my mother, who finds a mention, she's a family member mentioned. She said, "Why do I, why should I read about these failures? Don't write this book. Write about some successes." So I said, "What makes you think they were failures?" And she said, "Well, I haven't heard of them, even if they were revolutionaries. I have heard of Bose, I've heard of Bhagat Singh. Why have I not heard about these two people? I didn't even know they existed." And the question of being a failure is very complicated, because Chatto and Roy were abroad and in various countries, a lot of accounts of their deeds are in Russian, French, German, and Dutch, which is why we have not heard of them. Number two, Chatto's fate was not known. He's disappeared from sight. Nobody knew about his fate. Chatto and Roy both had eventually ended up fighting with, Nehru, Gandhi, and even Sarojini. For instance, Chatto called Sarojini. I mean, this is important to note. Chatto, by towards his later years, he called Sarojini a puppet in the hands of Nehru and Gandhi, which is why he was slowly forgotten about. There's that crazy reactionary who will not go along with the Congress. Congress, everybody wanted unity in the Congress. Nehru wanted unity in the Congress. So Chatto was just forgotten. Number three, they were not able to get enough support for the revolutionary movement, but many people have had this issue. Like I say, Aurobindo Ghosh, Bipin Chandra Pal, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, in a way, they were also failures because they were not able to muster enough arms. We forget how powerful the British Empire was at the height of its glory. Now we think of the UK as a tiny island, which it is, on the decline in some ways. But back then, the British Empire was immense, and they managed to blot out any accounts of these people. They confiscated their letters. They did not, they restricted their propaganda and their pamphlets. So they weren't really failures as such. If they were magnificent failures because they failed with so much conviction and passion. And even when they failed, they influenced a lot of what followed. For instance, Chatto began was one of the co-founders of the League Against Imperialism, which was like a UN for colonized nations. And Nehru borrowed heavily from that when he set up the non-aligned movement. But there was no acknowledgement of Chatto. But when the non-aligned movements, finally came to fruition in the 50s, many people acknowledged that its beginnings lay in the League Against Imperialism, where less powerful colonized nations had a say, unlike the UN and the League of Nations, where only the big powers had a say. And Roy was a very early trade unionist, okay, and a real supporter of the working class and the peasants, and this influenced many people, including Jayaprakash Narayan, Maniben Kara, VB Karnik, all of whom went on to lead important and trade unions, and which have helped with the labor laws that we have today, such as they are. So their influence was far reaching. It's just that they were not acknowledged and they did not play the game, which means that they did not align with Gandhi, Nehru, and the Congress. They were mavericks. They just said what they pleased.
Right.
You know.
And it's really interesting. You spoke about how powerful, we don't realize how powerful the British Empire was at
Yes.
that time.
Yes.
And I think a reason why a lot of them went to London to kind of fight
Yes.
was because, and I think you quote this in your book, that there was some historian who called it kind of the soft heart of the empire,
Yes.
which I really liked. Like the fact that they over here in India could not necessarily
Sure.
fight, but then over there it's under a different jurisdiction.
Yes,
They were given more
you're
liberties.
absolutely right. I forgot that I had mentioned that. So obviously the common language as well, because they could all speak English. Chatto especially, his English was great because he was very
Correct.
well educated. MN Roy learned to speak English very well. I mean, he learned to become a fantastic writer, all self-educated with zero education. And they all went to the UK because over there they had the UK was required to treat all its residents with a more liberal hand than they would have been treated in India. But even then, slowly, as they started getting more radical, they started being pursued by the British Secret
Correct.
Service, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, no, it's a very inspiring story. And just a final question for
Sure.
you. I know you've written about revolutionaries also in the past. Why do you think that people in today's age should be kind of picking up your book and learning about them and about their history?
Let's put aside the issue of revolution. Perhaps it's not relevant to us. Um, I have lived a very nomadic life myself for various reasons, which we won't go into, but I have. I think many people these days, many young people lead quite nomadic lives, at least within India. They go, travel from place to place. And if you read about Chatto and Roy in my book, they were the early cosmopolitans. Chatto, in particular, spoke some, I think, more than 10 languages, including Indian languages as well as European languages. Roy also spoke many languages. They were the early cosmopolitans and liberals. Before Nehru, they believed in secularism. They made no difference between Hindu, Muslim, Christian. They socialized with people of all countries. They took support from Germans, Mexicans, Russians, Swedish people, Dutch people, everybody. So they were the first cosmopolitans and the first, sort of internationalists, true globalists. And I think these days, as countries become more and more nationalist and inward looking, I think their ideas are well worth reading, even if we find them impractical. They're well worth reading and keeping in our minds.
No, that was a lovely answer. Thank you so much, Kavita.
Thank
Really,
you.
really appreciate your time.
Yeah.
And just for everyone watching, Spies, Lies and Allies is available to purchase. It's published by Westland. Kavita, we look forward to your next books as well. Is there anything in the works that you can reveal to
Honestly,
us?
people always ask me that, but after you write a book, you're so exhausted that you're not thinking about another book. So I'm just taking a good long break because I've written 4 books in 10 years. So
Wow,
that's a lot for me.
that is a lot. No,
Yeah.
no, no. All the best. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
being on the
Thank you
Print
for
Soft cover.
this. Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you.